A man sits alone in a room lit by a single oil lamp. The year is somewhere around AD 85. The city is Antioch, or perhaps Ephesus. Historians still argue, but the room is always the same in your imagination. Small, quiet, smelling of lamp oil and old papyrus. The man is a reader, and tonight, someone has handed him a scroll. He unrolls it to the first word, Biblos. In Greek, that word means scroll. It means document. It means, and this matters more than almost anything else in this video, it means legal record. The man reading this scroll would have known immediately that he was not about to receive a devotional. He was about to receive evidence. And the first piece of evidence Matthew offers is not a miracle, not a sermon, not a parable. It is a list of names. 42 names, to be precise, arranged in a very specific order, spanning 2,000 years of one family and Apos' history. And if you have ever read the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew and felt the quiet, slightly guilty impulse to skip ahead, you are not alone. Generations of readers have done exactly that. They see the names, they lose the thread, they move on to the manger. Here is what they missed. The list is not a list. The list is a proof. It is a mathematical argument, constructed in a language most modern readers do not know, using a system of numerical code that every literate Jewish person in the first century would have recognized immediately. Matthew chapter 1 is not the genealogy of a carpenter from Nazareth. It is the legal brief for a king. And hiding inside the arithmetic, inside the very count of the names, is a signature. A name. The name of the greatest king Israel ever had, stamped 3 times across the whole arc of human history. Before this video ends, you will see how a legal adoption performed by a quiet man in Nazareth solved a curse that God himself pronounced 600 years before Jesus was born. A curse so specific, so severe, that it seemed to make the arrival of the Messiah mathematically impossible. But we have to start with a number. The number is 14. Matthew 1 verse 17. One verse. Easy to read past. End quote. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ 14 generations. End quote. 14. 14. 14. You read that and you think, all right, Matthew likes symmetry. He is a tidy writer. He arranged the names into 3 groups of equal size to make the list easier to memorize. That is not wrong, but it is not nearly enough. Here is what most people miss. In the first century, there was no such thing as a Jewish number that was just a number. Numbers carried meaning. Numbers carried history. Numbers carried. And this is the critical piece, names. Because in Hebrew, every letter of the alphabet is also a numerical value. Aleph is 1. Bet is 2. Gimel is 3. The system runs all the way through the alphabet, and it means that every Hebrew word has a numerical equivalent. Every name has a number, and every number, when a first-century Jewish reader encountered it, could point back to a name. The system is called gematria, and it was not fringe mysticism. It was not the secret practice of a small sect. Scholars studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, texts produced by Jewish communities in the 2 centuries before Christ, have found gematria woven throughout. James Vanderkam, one of the leading authorities on the scrolls, documents how numerical wordplay was a standard feature of serious theological writing in Second Temple Judaism. When Matthew and Apos' first readers encountered a number that repeated 3 times in a single sentence, they did not reach for a concordance. They reached for the alphabet. They asked, what name does this number spell? And when you ask that question about the number 14, the answer stops you cold. The Hebrew name David is spelled with 3 letters. Dalet. Vav. Dalet. In Hebrew, Dalet has a numerical value of 4. Vav has a numerical value of 6. Dalet again, 4. For plus 6 plus 4. 14. David and Apos' name, in the numerical language of Hebrew, is 14. And Matthew has just written the name David. Not once, not twice. 3 times into the architecture of his genealogy. Every Jewish reader who heard this document read aloud in a first-century synagogue would have felt it land. 14. 14. 14. David. 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 Stay with me. Because this changes everything about what Matthew is doing. He is not padding a list. He is not rounding numbers for neatness. He is making a legal argument in the language his audience already spoke. He is saying, The man I am about to introduce to you bears the name of Israel and Apos, greatest king, not as a title, not as a metaphor, but embedded in the mathematical structure of history itself. The count of the generations is the proof. The number is the signature. And the signature belongs to David. This is why Matthew opens with the phrase and quote, son of David and quote, before he says anything else about Jesus. Before the angel. Before Bethlehem. Before the star. The first credential Matthew presents is a number that spells a name. Now, you might be wondering something. If Matthew is encoding David and Apos' name in the count of the generations, why does the count seem slightly off? Scholars have noted for centuries that if you actually count the names in Matthew and Apos' list, the third group does not quite reach 14 in the same way as the first two. This is not a mistake Matthew missed. This is Matthew telling you that the third era is incomplete. The restoration is not finished. The story is still being written. The final 14 is not closed. It is open. It is open because the king has not yet returned to his throne. But that is the end of the argument. We are still near the beginning. Because before you can understand why the number matters, you have to understand what three groups of 14 actually represent. And the answer is the entire history of Israel, compressed into arithmetic. Abraham to David. David to Babylon. Babylon to Jesus. Say those three phrases slowly, and you have just summarized 2,000 years of Israeli history in 11 words. Rise. Fall. Restoration. That is the shape of the story Matthew is telling, and he is telling it in 3 acts, exactly the way a Jewish scribe trained on the Torah and the prophets would have been taught to see history, not as a random sequence of events, not as one thing after another, as a pattern with an author behind it. The first era, Abraham to David, is the era of promise. God calls one man out of Ur of the Chaldeans and tells him that through his descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Abraham has no children. He is old. His wife is barren. And yet the promise is made. And over 14 generations, something extraordinary happens. A family becomes a clan. A clan becomes a tribe. A tribe becomes 12 tribes. 12 tribes become a nation. And that nation, against all military probability, against the armies of Egypt and Canaan and the Philistines, produces a king. A shepherd boy from Bethlehem who kills a giant with a stone and goes on to unite the 12 tribes into a single kingdom and establishes his throne in Jerusalem. David, generation 14 of the first era, the arrival of the name inside the name. The second era, David to Babylon, is the era of collapse. And here is where Matthew and Apos' list becomes uncomfortable, because the second era is not a steady decline. It is a long, slow, painful unraveling. Solomon builds the temple, the most magnificent structure in the ancient world, and then spends the last decades of his life building shrines to foreign gods to please the women he should not have married. The kingdom splits. The north goes first, taken by Assyria. The south staggers on through a succession of kings, some faithful, most not, a few catastrophically wicked, until the year 586 BC, when the army of Nebuchadnezzar breaks through the walls of Jerusalem, burns the temple to the ground, and marches the survivors east into Babylon in chains. Matthew names this moment with a single word: Metoikesia, the deportation, the exile, the moment when the city of David ceased to exist as a sovereign nation and became a memory. 14 generations from the height of the kingdom to the ashes of it. And then the third era, Babylon to the Christ, the era of waiting. This is the longest silence in Israel and Apos' history. 500 years between the return from exile and the birth of Jesus, during which Israel is ruled by Persians, then Greeks, then Romans, and during which the prophets go quiet for 400 years. No new word from God. No burning bush. No thunder from Sinai. Just silence. And a people waiting for a king who does not come. Until the night a young woman in Nazareth is visited by an angel. Until the night a star rises over Bethlehem. Until the first cry of an infant in a stable cuts through that 400-year silence like a blade. 14 generations of waiting. Now watch what happens next. Matthew has just done something that no Roman writer, no Greek philosopher, no Egyptian chronicler would have thought to do. He has taken the chaos of 2,000 years, wars and famines and exiles and plagues and assassinations and coups, and he has shown you the shape underneath the chaos. He has shown you that history, even at its most violent and broken and silent, was moving. It was moving in a specific direction, toward a specific person, with a specific name. This is not the structure of accident. This is the structure of composition. And if you are a Jewish reader in the 1st century, hearing this document read aloud for the first time, you recognize the structure immediately. You have heard it before. In the Psalms, in the prophets, in the way your teachers described the covenant God made with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The promise that David and Apos' throne would be established forever, that one of David and Apos' descendants would reign without end. Matthew is not introducing a new idea. He is showing you that the old idea, the ancient promise, the 600-year-old covenant, has just been kept. The 3 eras are not 3 random chapters. They are 3 movements of a single symphony. And the symphony is resolving. But before you hear the resolution, you need to know what Matthew left out of the list. Because what he chose to remove is just as important as what he chose to include. There are 3 names missing from Matthew and Apos' list. Not accidentally missing, not forgotten, deliberately, surgically removed, by a writer who knew exactly what he was cutting and why. If you compare Matthew and Apos' genealogy against the royal records in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, you will find 3 kings sitting between Joram and Uzziah who simply do not appear. Their names are Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. 3 generations. 3 kings who each reigned in Jerusalem. Each appear in the official historical record, and each were erased from Matthew and Apos' covenant list with no explanation given. So why did Matthew cut them? The answer begins with a woman named Athaliah. Athaliah was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, the most notoriously wicked royal couple in the entire Hebrew Bible. Her mother Jezebel had introduced Baal worship into Israel on an industrial scale, had murdered the prophets of God, and had engineered the judicial killing of an innocent man named Naboth to steal his vineyard. Athaliah inherited her mother and Apos' instincts. When her son Ahaziah died, she did not step aside. She seized the throne of Judah herself, the only woman ever to rule as monarch in Jerusalem. And to secure her position, she ordered the execution of every member of the royal family. Her own grandchildren, the entire Davidic line, murdered in a single purge. She nearly ended the covenant of God with one command. One infant survived, a baby named Joash, hidden in the temple by a priest named Jehoiada for 6 years while Athaliah ruled. Eventually Athaliah was deposed and executed, Joash was crowned, and the Davidic line continued. But the bloodline had been contaminated, in Matthew and Apos' theological accounting, by 3 generations of kings who were direct descendants of Jezebel and Apos' daughter. Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, the Baal line inside the house of David. Matthew erases them. This is not historical carelessness. In the ancient world, genealogies were never neutral documents. They were arguments. They were selections. A genealogy told you not just who someone descended from, but what kind of person they were, what covenants they stood in, what bloodlines they honored, what disgraces they refused to carry. Matthew is writing a covenant genealogy, not a biological census. And in a covenant genealogy, you have the right, the obligation, to remove the lines that broke the covenant. Here is what is remarkable about that. Matthew removes 3 kings to keep his theological record clean. But then he does something that seems to contradict everything he just did. He adds 5 women who have absolutely no business appearing in a royal Jewish genealogy. Not by the standards of the 1st century. Not by any standard of the ancient world. Women did not appear in genealogies. Not because they were unimportant, but because genealogies in that culture traced legal and tribal inheritance through the male line. A genealogy was a chain of fathers. To include a mother was unusual. To include 5 was unheard of. And the 5 women Matthew chooses are not the ones you would expect. He does not choose Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the mother of the covenant nation. He does not choose Rebekah, or Leah, or Rachel, the matriarchs whose names every Jewish child learned before they could walk. He does not choose the obvious candidates, the respectable women, the ones whose inclusion would feel safe and ceremonial and appropriate. He chooses Tamar. Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Judah who dressed as a prostitute and seduced her own father-in-law to obtain the son she had been denied by legal injustice. The story is in Genesis 38, and it is not comfortable reading. And yet, when Judah discovered what had happened, he did not condemn her. He said, and quote, "She is more righteous than I." End quote. Tamar broke every social rule that existed, and she was exactly right to do it. And Matthew puts her name first. He chooses Rahab. Rahab was a Canaanite, a prostitute in Jericho who hid 2 Israelite spies under stalks of flax on her roof and bargained for the survival of her family when the walls came down. She was not an Israelite. She had no claim on the covenant of Abraham. She was a professional sinner in an enemy city, and she is in the bloodline of the son of David. He chooses Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite, and this matters more than it might seem. The law of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 23 explicitly states that no Moabite shall enter the assembly of God, even to the 10th generation. Ruth was 1 generation. She had no legal standing before God by the letter of the law. She was a widow, a foreigner, a gleaner of leftover grain in a field that did not belong to her. And she is the great-grandmother of King David. He chooses Bathsheba, but notice how Matthew names her. He does not write in quote, Bathsheba, end quote. He writes in quote, the wife of Uriah, end quote, the wife of the man David had murdered, the woman David took by the abuse of royal power. Matthew will not let you forget whose wife she was before she was David and Apos. The sin is built into the name. The grief is built into the name, and she is still in the list. Because God did not abandon the line when David committed the worst act of his life. He stayed. And then Mary, the 5th woman, the one whose inclusion finally makes the pattern unmistakable. Because Mary and Apos' story, like the stories of the 4 women before her, involves a pregnancy that could not be explained by ordinary means. A pregnancy that looked, from the outside, like scandal, like disgrace, like exactly the kind of story you would not put in a royal document if you were trying to make your subject look respectable. Matthew puts it in anyway. Pay attention to this. Every single woman in this genealogy represents a moment when God worked through exactly the situation that human judgment would have rejected. Tamar, the unjust legal system. Rahab, the enemy outsider. Ruth, the law that seemed to exclude her. Bathsheba, the king and Apos' worst sin. Mary, the story nobody would believe. Matthew is not just proving that Jesus is the son of David. He is showing you what kind of God produced the son of David. A God who does not wait for clean circumstances. A God who does not require respectable vessels. A God who works through the broken story, the wrong background, the impossible situation, and produces a king. But even that is not the most astonishing part of what Matthew has hidden in this list. Because sitting in the middle of the second era, in the generation just before the exile to Babylon, is a king whose presence in this genealogy creates what seems like an insurmountable problem. A king under a curse so severe that his being in the list at all appears to make the arrival of the Messiah legally impossible. His name is Jeconiah. Open your Bible to Jeremiah chapter 22. You are in the final years of the southern kingdom. Jerusalem is still standing, barely. The Babylonian army has already come once, taken hostages, installed a puppet king. The prophet Jeremiah is watching his city die in slow motion, and he is angry, and he is grieving, and he is about to say something that will echo across 6 centuries and land like a theological bomb in the middle of Matthew and Apos' genealogy. The king on the throne is a man named Jeconiah, also called Coniah, also called Jehoiakim. The sources use all 3 names, which tells you something about how little anyone agreed on what to call him or what to make of him. He reigned for 3 months and 10 days. That is the entire length of his kingship. 3 months. Then Nebuchadnezzar came, and Jeconiah surrendered, and the exile began. And before he was taken, Jeremiah spoke over him. End quote. Write this man down as childless. End quote. God says through Jeremiah. End quote. A man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. End quote. Read that slowly. None of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David. This is not a mild rebuke. This is not a temporary setback. This is a covenant curse pronounced by a prophet of God over a specific man and all his descendants. And the curse does not expire. It does not come with a sunset clause. It stands. Now here's the problem. Joseph, the carpenter of Nazareth, the man who will raise Jesus, is a direct descendant of Jeconiah. Matthew tells you this explicitly. Jeconiah appears in the genealogy right at the hinge between the second and third eras, right at the moment of exile, and Joseph and Apos. Line runs straight through him, which means Joseph is the legal heir of Jeconiah and Apos. Royal line, which means Joseph carries the curse. And if Jesus is Joseph and Apos' biological son, if Joseph is the father in any biological sense, then Jesus inherits the curse along with the throne. A descendant of Jeconiah cannot sit on David and Apos' throne. Jeremiah said so. God said so. The Messiah cannot be Joseph and Apos' biological son. But here is the other half of the problem. The Messiah must be a legal heir to David and Apos' throne. That is the whole point of the covenant in 2 Samuel 7. God promised David that one of his descendants would reign forever. The Messiah has to come from David and Apos' line, legally, traceable, documentable. A king without a legal claim to the throne is not a king. He is a pretender. So Matthew is standing in front of two walls that appear to be moving toward each other. Wall 1. The Messiah must be a legal heir to David and Apos' throne through the royal Solomonic line. Joseph carries that line. Wall 2. No descendant of Jeconiah can sit on David and Apos' throne. Joseph carries that curse. The solution to this problem is so quiet, so understated, so buried in a single verse of Matthew and Apos' genealogy, that most readers walk right past it without feeling the ground shift beneath their feet. Matthew 1 verse 16. After 41 verses of so-and-so fathered so-and-so, the same verb, the same structure, generation after generation, Matthew changes the sentence. He does not write, and Joseph fathered Jesus, He writes, and Jacob fathered Joseph the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, The verb changes. The structure breaks. Matthew reaches the end of the biological chain and stops it. Joseph does not father Jesus. Joseph marries the mother of Jesus. He takes a pregnant woman as his wife, knowing the child is not his, and in that act, in that one quiet decision made in a carpenter and Apos' house in Nazareth, he performs a legal adoption that the Roman and Jewish world of his day would have recognized immediately as binding. This is where the yikus, the Hebrew concept of legal lineage, does something extraordinary. In Jewish legal tradition, a man who formally adopts a child grants that child full legal standing in his family. Not partial standing, not honorary membership, full inheritance rights, full tribal identity, full covenant participation. When Joseph takes Mary as his wife and names the child Jesus, the naming is the adoption. Jesus receives everything that belongs to Joseph and Apos' legal line. The royal claim to David and Apos' throne. The Solomonic inheritance. The legal right to be called son of David. But not the curse. Because the curse of Jeconiah runs through Joseph and Apos' biology, not through his legal name. Jesus does not share Joseph and Apos' biology. He shares Joseph and Apos' name. And a name, in the legal world of the first century, was enough. It was everything. And here is the part nobody tells you. Luke and Apos' genealogy, which traces a different line than Matthew and Apos', runs through David as well, but through a different son. Not Solomon, the royal heir, but Nathan, Solomon and Apos' brother. Luke traces Mary and Apos' biological ancestry, and Mary and Apos' line reaches David through Nathan, cleanly, without passing through Jeconiah, without touching the curse at all. So Jesus receives two things through two lines. Through Joseph and Apos' legal adoption, the royal Solomonic claim to the throne of David, the legal right to kingship. Through Mary and Apos' biological descent, the actual bloodline of David, running through Nathan, uncontaminated by the curse of Jeconiah. The curse is bypassed. The covenant is fulfilled. The legal claim is secured. And the biological line is intact. 600 years before Jesus was born, Jeremiah pronounced a curse that seemed to make the Messiah impossible. And God and Apos' answer, worked out across 6 centuries of genealogy and covenant and exile and return, was a carpenter who chose to say yes to a pregnant woman and give her child his name. One adoption, one quiet act, One man who decided that legal fatherhood was worth more than biological certainty. And with that decision, the walls stopped moving. The problem that had no solution had always had a solution, hidden in the structure of two genealogies that would not be written for another 600 years. Hidden in the difference between a biological son and a named son. Hidden in the gap between fathered and husband of, a gap of exactly 2 words in the Greek text, and the width of the entire covenant of God. This is not coincidence. This is not a theological loophole that later Christians invented to patch a problem. This is the thing Matthew was building toward from the first word of his gospel. Biblos, legal record. The record was always going to end here, at the moment where the biology stops and the adoption begins. At the moment where the curse is answered not by power, not by miracle, not by the armies of heaven, but by one man and Apos' decision to be a father to a child that was not his. God composed this. Pull back for a moment. Not from the text, from the whole picture. You have just traced a line that runs from Abraham, a childless old man in Mesopotamia who heard a voice and believed it, through 41 generations of shepherds and kings and exiles and widows and foreigners and failures, all the way to a carpenter in Apos' workshop in Nazareth where a man named Joseph is holding a newborn child that is not biologically his and choosing, in the silence of that moment, to give the child his name. 2,000 years, 42 generations, 3 eras of history, one number, repeated 3 times, spelling one name in a language written in fire and stone before Jesus was born. This is not the work of human planning. No human scribe sat down in the age of Abraham and said, in 2,000 years, I will arrange the generations so that the count spells the name of the greatest king who has not yet been born. No royal court in David and Apos' time engineered the precise number of descendants between the shepherd king and the exile so that it would land on 14. No editor in Babylon, sitting in the ruins of the first temple, calculated how many generations it would take before the line produced a child who could bypass a curse through adoption while simultaneously fulfilling a biological covenant through a second genealogy running parallel through a different son of David. No human composed this, and yet here it is. In the arithmetic, in the names, in the gaps, in the women who should not be there, in the kings who were removed, in the 2 words, husband of, that changed the sentence structure and changed everything. Matthew knew what he was doing when he wrote the word Biblos. He was handing you a legal brief. He was saying, I am not asking you to feel this. I am asking you to count. Count the generations. Count the names. Count the number. And when you arrive at the number, ask what name it spells. And when you know the name it spells, ask who that name belongs to. And when you know who that name belongs to, you will know who this child is. He is the son of David, not as a title, not as an honorific, not as a piece of theological poetry written to make a peasant carpenter sound more impressive than he was, as a legal fact, established by count, confirmed by structure, sealed by adoption, verified by a second genealogy running through a different bloodline to the same ancestor. The case has been made. The argument is complete. The brief is closed. Now, 3 things to take with you. The first is this. When Matthew and Apos' first readers heard the number 14 repeated 3 times in a single sentence, they did not reach for a commentary. They heard music. They heard a name being sung in arithmetic, David, 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 across the whole sweep of history. And they understood immediately that the writer was not making a claim about a man. He was making a claim about a pattern that had been moving for 2,000 years toward a single point. Most of us have been taught to read the Bible as a collection of stories. Matthew is inviting you to read it as a score, as something composed. And when you hear it that way, when you listen for the pattern beneath the names, the music is extraordinary. The second thing is this. The 5 women in Matthew and Apos' genealogy are not decorations. They are the thesis. Tamar, who broke every rule to obtain justice and was called righteous for it. Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute who became the ancestor of King David. Ruth, the Moabite widow whom the law technically excluded, who walked into Israel on the strength of a promise and changed the bloodline of God and Apos' anointed king. Bathsheba, named only as the wife of the man David wronged, whose grief Matthew refuses to erase from the record. And Mary, whose unexplained pregnancy looked, from the outside, exactly like the kind of scandal that disqualifies you. Every single one of them was the wrong person in the wrong situation at the wrong moment. And every single one of them was exactly where God was working. If you have ever felt that your background disqualifies you, that your history is too complicated, your story too broken, your past too visible, Matthew chapter 1 is written specifically to answer that feeling. The genealogy of the Son of God runs straight through the people nobody would have chosen. That is not an accident in the record. That is the record and Apos' entire point. The third thing, and this is the one that will stay with you longest. Joseph is in this genealogy for one reason. Not because he fathered Jesus. He did not. Not because he was the most powerful man in the story. He was a carpenter. Not because history remembered his name above others. It almost did not. Joseph is in this genealogy because he said yes. An angel came to him in a dream and told him that the child his fiancée was carrying was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and that he should take her as his wife, and that he should name the child Jesus. And Matthew tells us, with the same economy of language he uses throughout the genealogy, that when Joseph woke from the dream, he did what the angel commanded. He took Mary as his wife. He named the child. That naming, that single act of quiet obedience in the dark, is what transferred the legal right to David and Apos' throne. That is what bypassed the curse of Jeconiah. That is what completed the 3x14 signature of David and Apos' name across the arc of history. That is what turned the genealogy from an open question into a closed argument. God had been composing this for 2,000 years. And the final note, the one that resolved the chord, was played by a man most people would have expected to walk away. He did not walk away. He woke up. He went to Mary. He gave the child his name. And with that, the scroll Matthew opened with the word biblos, legal record, legal document, legal brief, was complete. The case for the king had been made. Not by armies. Not by miracles. Not by the weight of political power or the approval of the religious establishment of Jerusalem. By a number that spelled a name. By women who had no business being in the list. By kings who were removed to keep the covenant clean. By a curse that seemed impossible to escape. And by one carpenter who understood, or perhaps simply trusted, without fully understanding, that saying yes to a child was the most consequential legal act in the history of the human race. 42 generations. One name hidden in the arithmetic. One adoption that answered a 600-year-old curse. One God who composed all of it. Every exile, every widow, every removed king, every impossible pregnancy, into a single argument that begins with a list of names most people want to skip and ends with the birth of the one person the whole list was always moving toward. You do not have to skip the genealogy anymore. It was written for you.